Good morning, everyone. So last year we introduced for the three lecture session, and which this one is really a second about faith and philosophy. Mr. Ewing talked about the Calvin perception of faith and how it was introduced and presented by him. Today we will took a larger scope with other practitioners and discuss a different version of faith in theology, which will bring us to some discussion about other scope of interpreting faith, such as science, economy, or philosophy. Next week we will have someone from the Princeton Center of Theological Inquiries. We will make a parallel between a science field of astrobiology and faith and see how it can be interpreted altogether, what are their common relations, and other more interesting examples. Please introduce the area.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be back with you. In preparation for next week, I brought a couple of books, including one published by the Center of Theological Inquiry. You're welcome to take them, bring them back. I asked Maxime if I'll just leave my bag, and next week, if you want to put them back, I'll swing by and pick them up. But a couple by John Polkinghorne, Paul Davies, and others that are really working on this interaction of science and religion, faith and reason in a contemporary world, looking at astrophysics, quantum physics. Newton's world separated them, but Einstein's world, science suddenly became more mystical than theology. So it's a good place to go. And the program next week was wonderful. We ran 2 years at Princeton at CTI. I'm a trustee down there. And we did 2 years of work on astrobiology and theology. And it really was an extraordinary deep dive into these conversations about what is life. The scientists quickly learned that what they thought theologians believed about God was antiquity, was from the 17th century. No, we don't have those ideas about God. God's not a watchmaker sitting up in heaven somewhere winding things up. So it was a great conversation. Tom sent me some questions. We're going to wait till the end because I didn't have a chance last night to go back and integrate them. So let's hold them for the end of today and we'll just do a wrap up of it. What I want to do today is a quick brief review of the biblical tradition that we started with last week and pick up another strand coming out of the Bible, jump over Calvin and the 16th century right into the early modern period in the age of science and reason by way of Max Weber, go back quickly. You all have to go back and do the course with Maxime on epistemology and the Enlightenment. I just want to run through an Enlightenment problematic and then end where Tillich ended, with some doses of Tillich on the question of faith and reason, mainly from his book, The Foundations Foundations of Faith. Yeah, I was going to say Shaking the Foundations, but Foundations of Faith, and of course his system. Thank you for helping with Tillich. Last week, to your handout, just I'll follow it so it keeps me on track. Last week I said the Hebrew Bible uses the word emunah 49 times, emun 5 more times. Those are nouns. The verb form aman is used over 100 times. The verb is the really complex one. It's once translated as nursing. When Naomi nurses the child of Ruth, becomes a nursemaid to her, it's aman. It's usually caretaking, trust. The noun is more just steadfast, determined, caretaking, dependability. And I said that word, the Septuagint, translates the noun as pistis. And it's consistently, all the way through the Septuagint, translates the noun form. The New Testament uses that word, pistis, which means to believe, to trust, more than 250 times. You see how it explodes in the New Testament. And the verb form, pistuo, is used another 250 times in the New Testament. I said last week, 91 times alone in the Gospel of John. And you really see that becomes believe, trust in, have faith in, becomes a really powerful New Testament terminology. Latin gives us two words which became interchangeably used around pistuo. One was fides, which was a moral virtue of giving yourself to another person, to being dependable, being trustworthy, was the basis of public life. You could trust your elected officials. You could trust the subways were running. There was a certain kind of public civic virtue of fides. The other word is credo, which ends up in the creeds, and it means I believe, and they get used interchangeably often in Latin. For instance, in Augustine, to have faith and to believe. Anselm's, fides quarum intellectum, faith seeks understanding, or faith seeks after intellectual comprehension, became part of the Catholic tradition, and it's still there, I said, all the way through Vatican II, through Benedict, through Francis, this notion that faith is always reasonable, and that revelation and reason go together, and reason interprets revelation, and they don't oppose one another. Luther opposed them much more strongly, paradoxically. Faith was a gift from God that stands over against reason. Luther once called human reason that great whore that tempts us away. Now, he had colorful language, but he was tempted. It was tempted by reason to think things through, rather trust God. And as we saw last week, for Luther, this paradoxical trust allowed you to find God in the most unreasonable places, or the most ungodly places. So he comes to the point where he says, on the cross, you see the divinity of God most clearly in Jesus, in those places where you would not expect to see it. And that's because you see it by faith, not by reason. Calvin, I said, was more moderate. I put him in between Luther's paradox and the Reformation, the Catholic merging of them, with faith being the work of the Spirit, which is within us, leads us to understanding. And as I said last week, if you remember, for Calvin, it turns and it becomes more a matter of the heart than of the head. So we kind of left Calvin there. Let me go back with you to the biblical tradition and pick up another strand, which is going to come out as part of the modern programmatic issues around the Enlightenment. That is the notion of the relationship between faith and doubt. Matthew 21, Mark 11, Acts 10, and 11, Romans 14 are all incidents where the King James Version uses the word doubt. The word in Greek in each of those places is diakrino. And if you know your Greek, you recognize it immediately. It means, krino means to judge, dia means to go through. It means to judge through something. It means to discern. It means also then to hesitate. And that's where it picks up the connotations of being unsure, wavering. You're not ready to make a firm commitment. I want to think this thing through. It's the process of thinking something through. It's really interesting because that word is used in James 1:6, but the King James translates it there as wavering. And Jude 1:12 says to have mercy, tells us to have mercy on those who are wavering, those who are diakrinomenoi. Eugene Peterson translates it, go easy on those who hesitate in the faith. Notice that this notion of thinking for yourself becomes a matter of hesitation in our translations. I'm not sure quite that's what the Greek means, but that's the way we translate it. It means doubt. Matthew 14:31, Matthew 28:17 use a different word. This time it's diastazo, which comes from the Greek word dis, which simply means twice. And it simply means to have two minds about something. To be double-minded. This on the one hand, that on the other hand, we translate that word often as doubt. But I don't think it really is doubt. I think it's more something else. It's a double-minded, to be of two minds about this. Other translations, the NIV, if you check them, the NRSV will use doubt for other words. The NIV uses the word in Hebrews 7:7, gives us the word doubt when the Greek is antilogia, against logic, against reason, that which is unreasonable. The NIV translates it as doubt. What I'm seeing in this is that modern translators tend to see doubt all over the place, where it really isn't there in the biblical tradition itself. It's not there in the New Testament. The best known New Testament instance, of course, is Thomas. But the word is not doubt for Thomas. It's literally, Jesus tells him, don't be without faith, apistos. It's an alpha negative, pistis, apistos. Don't be without faith, have faith. It's much more direct than doubt. In all the times I can find the word doubt used in the New Testament, they all add up to a handful. It's all quite small. I go back to the New Testament, and the opposition to faith is not doubt. The opposition is fear. Overwhelmingly in the Gospels, Jesus keeps telling people, have no fear. Fear not. Fear not. Perfect faith drives out all fear. Somehow in this modern era, doubt entered into the lectionary to be what the opposite of faith was. And it leads Tillich to say, if a theologian doesn't doubt, you're not really a theologian. So part of this modern era has been to try to recover the legitimacy of doubting, of being double-minded, of being judgment, of having krino, of thinking things through. But seeing really where is the opposition? How did it happen in the modern era? I'm going to get to that in a moment, but before I do, I want to take a detour. And I want to take a detour through science, because it really is the emergence of what we call the modern scientific worldview, which is going to be an engine which is going to drive much of what we're doing. I went back to Max Weber's 1918 lecture, Science as a Vocation, to ground myself. A wonderful lecture he delivered in Munich to the University Science Department. He was asked to come and lecture to the young scientists about science as a vocation. He spends the first 10 pages telling them about, as a political economist, the external processes by which you get a job, and then gets to the end of that whole section and says, but you probably didn't invite me to lecture about that. I just thought it was interesting to talk about. Pure Max Weber. He moves on in the second part of the lecture to talk about the Renaissance in Europe as the place that first brought together, he says, two different strands of thinking. One was the logic of the ancient Greeks, and the other was the notion of empirical evidence gained from controlled experimentation. And Leonardo da Vinci is his key person here. And he says the Renaissance put these two together for the first time in a new way to generate knowledge, not out of just logic, not out of just rational discourse like Plato and Aristotle, but coupling it with the actual empirical controlled experiment that gave you evidence and then documenting the evidence. You can quickly see how that line goes from Da Vinci to Galileo to Newton and Bacon and eventually to Einstein. And I won't go through that whole process, but the emergence of this modern scientific process, this worldview that connected technical knowledge, reason, with theoretical reason, and put the two together to produce a body of knowledge which effectively showed it could control the universe. It could demonstrate through its outcomes. I think of Galileo's famous statement saying, look through the lens of you'll see for yourself. And the bishop saying, no, we're not going to look through the lens, because if we looked through your telescope, we would not be trusting the Bible. We would trust the telescope over the Bible. And so the bishops never did look through his telescope to see what he was seeing to give him the argument. And of course, he was recanted on charges of heresy, and he probably did mumble as he was leaving the courtroom. Nevertheless, it moves. That whole process of looking at lenses, looking through scientific evidence, looking through equipment, instruments to gain knowledge over against the Bible, it's going to lead things like Luther insisting that Galileo had to be wrong because the Bible says Joshua put up his hands and stopped the sun. So that means the sun is moving. The Bible says the sun moves and not the earth. You see the way in which those two are beginning to conflict, and it's going to accelerate through the 19th century with Darwin, into the 20th century with Einstein, the long-length universe. Henry Morris, I just went and collected my books on creation science, still argues that God created the world in 6,000 years, but built into the world evidence that made it look like 10 billion to fool people who thought that their own methods of science were better than the Bible. So God is intentionally tricking. That's Henry Morris and the creation science arguments. You see those debates still going on, and don't dismiss them, because a whole lot of school systems across this nation, like in Arkansas and Texas, require children to learn creation in school along with evolution, and say that creation is a scientific worldview. That still is a deep part of the culture here that we're struggling against. Weber, let me read a passage from him that really goes back and I think nails the problematic here for science. Scientific progress, he says, is a fraction, but the most important fraction of the process of intellectualization, it's on page 2 there, that we have been undergoing for thousands of years, and which nowadays is usually judged in such an extremely negative way. Let us first clarify what this intellectualist rationalization created by science and by scientifically oriented technology means practically. It's on page 2 under my point 2. Does it mean that we today, for instance, everyone sitting in this hall, have a greater knowledge of the conditions of life under which we exist than has an American Indian or a Hottentot? Hardly. Unless he is a physicist, one who rides on the streetcar has no idea how the car happened to get in motion. He does not need to know. The increasing intellectualization and rationalization do not therefore indicate an increase in general knowledge of the conditions under which one lives. It means something else. Namely, the knowledge or belief that if one but wished, one could learn at any time. Hence, it means principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means the world is disenchanted. Wow. One need no longer have any recourse to magical means in order to master or employ the spirits, as did the savages for whom such mysterious powers existed. Technical means and calculation perform the service. This, above all, is what intellectualization means. And then he goes on to talk about the fate of our time is to live in disenchantment.
A lot of us are missing page 2, so if you're interested, we'll try to get it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, some people have it and some people don't. So, okay, great.
Don't know how that happened. Sorry.
Sorry, no.
Okay, we'll get page 2. And you can go back and read Max Weber's Sciences of Vocation. That notion of disenchantment, of taking away, that we don't, and it's, I'm going to come back to this because I think in the 20th century, what we've watched is an enormous global effort to re-enchant the world. Whether it be through Native American religious practices, the new centers of spirituality are growing, Richard Rohr's Center for Contemplative Action, One Faith Seminary, the recovery of earth traditions, of Wiccan traditions, the number of people I have who are now members of the friends and colleagues who are doing Buddhist meditation and chanting, and the most important one, the rise of global Pentecostalism. An enormous force of 500 million people globally across the world for whom the Spirit becomes active and spiritual gifts, signs and wonders, miracles happen. You have to expect them. The number of people who now combine those worlds and re-enchant while they're still doing intellectualization. Yes, go to the doctor, but still have somebody come and lay hands on you or pour oil on you while you're going to the doctor to cure your cancer. That is an enormous movement of re-enchantment that's happening globally, but it doesn't happen without pushback. I think it's Mount Sinai does an ad, more science, less fear. It's science which drives out fear. That's still there in a kind of a global phenomena of just, we're not quite sure, how do you re-enchant in an age of such scientific exactitude? And I think we're living through that. And those are questions to really be brought up. The key for me is that for Weber, the notion of prayer working, the notion of the mysterious gets linked to magic. And it was the demagicalization. The word in disenchantment actually in German is demagicalization. And there is an effort to push back and to remagicalize. And Weber at the end of that essay says, we're going to have a new prophecy arise. It won't arise out of the academy because academics can't be prophets. But it's going to have to arise somewhere else. And I think we're watching across the globe as we see new religious movements and efforts to regain a new sense of the dimensions of the mystery. And that's where I think astrobiology can lead us into, because some of the times I heard those astrobiologists talking and I thought, you guys are more mysterious than any theologian I've ever heard, talking about new kinds of life forms, and we call them angels. But you're talking about possibilities of life that don't have DNA. And okay, that sounds to me kind of a mysterious reimagining of the world. In any case, that's happening on one side, the intellectualization that Weber is naming in science. But something else is going on. That's on the technical side. That's what Tillich is going to call the technical side of reason, where it becomes grounded in empirical evidence under controlled experimental conditions that produce evidence that can be reproduced and gives us a body of knowledge which grows. Tillich says there's another kind of reason, and that is the reason that seeks meaning and values. It operates at a higher level. It operates through the philosophers. And he says this too has gone through an enormous transformation in the period after the Reformation, but it starts with Descartes. It starts with René Descartes. Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting Reason and Seeking Truths in Sciences, 1637. Descartes is a mathematician and a philosopher from Belgium, works in French. He has a little discourse in 1637 in which he says he was going out on the way to the coronation of the Emperor of Denmark, stopped by to see the wars going on. He's in the middle of the 100 Years' Wars, and tourists would go out on the mountainsides and watch the battles going on. And so he was with a group that had gone out to see the most recent battle, coming back through Germany, and he gets caught in a snowstorm, and he's in an inn where he has to spend 3 days because they can't move. They can't continue on the journey. He's caught for 3 or 4 days in an inn by himself, and he says, I looked around the inn. There was nobody there worthy of having a discussion with me. And so he retires to his room and says he's going to set about a thought experiment, and the thought experiment's going to be on his own. And that is that he says, he goes through a whole section in which he says, everybody knows that a city which has been built by several people is a monstrosity. Cities become complex. The best cities are built by one mind. And the best engines are built by one person thinking things through, directly going against the tendency to put together a committee to solve a problem. Better to have one person think it through because committees by their very nature cannot work to produce something meaningful. Those of you who are Presbyterians, you know what this means all the time. But it's directly undercutting Calvin's notion of a collective episcope and a collective mind being the best mind. He's arguing that a single person thinking on his own, because as Kant will tell us, the fairer sex is incapable of this. It's a male sitting alone thinking, and his thought experiment is, let me go the way of doubt, and let me doubt what exists. And he then goes into a whole discourse where he doubts existence of everything. Some of you have done this when you were kids. You wondered, what if we were all just some kind of experiment in somebody's test tube somewhere, and the whole world was imagined? And all of us have seen The Matrix, where suddenly the world that looks to be real turns out to be nothing more than a computer formula. Descartes goes all the way that direction until he gets to this point, and you all know it because you all had Philosophy 101, where he's writing in French because he wanted the book to be read by the popular audience. The Latin translation comes later, but he writes in French, Je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. What he comes to say later when he explains it in his longer Latin treatise, the Cogito ergo sum, what he couldn't doubt is that something was doubting. He could doubt everything else except that there was someone doubting. And that someone doubting, even if he didn't know who that someone was, what he knew that it existed. And so he establishes the existence, not of God and not of the world, but of the doubting mind. And that once that's established, he could then go back and work his way through. In philosophy class, we call that the turn to the subject. And we say it's as revolutionary as the heliocentric universe offered by Copernicus, or Copernicus said, the earth revolves around the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. What Descartes says is that truth starts not with thinking about God, but the thinking self. Truth starts with the autonomous self-thinking, and then you begin to think about the world through that, which means this turn to the subject puts an anthropocentric center on all logic. And it really is male-centric. This world that gets thought about then gets thrown out in front as objective, and it's going to transform the whole universe because it means, against Calvin, against the biblical tradition, reason is no longer something done by a collected group. Reason no longer emerges from the discourse of a community. Reason emerges out of my mind. It's so interesting that he calls it discourse on the method, but he's not talking to anyone. It's the self that talks, it thinks, that's going to establish the truth of this modern era. Let me tell you some of the ways in which that impacts the way we think about the world. 1605 is the earliest citation in the Oxford English Dictionary for the word individual being used for a human subject. The word individuum in Latin means that which cannot be divided. It is a scholastic. It comes into use in Latin and in English during the scholastic period. Robert Bellamy, for instance, whose treatise on the individual Trinity is an argument against Islam that the Trinity is not three but one. It cannot be divided. And all of the usage of it, prior to Descartes, the word individual refers to God. God is the individual. The only other usage in theology is in the church. The individual church means the one undivided Holy Roman Catholic Church. It's undividable. After Descartes, that word suddenly gets applied to human subjects who take the new place of sovereignty alongside a sovereign God and a sovereign church and a sovereign state. There's this new sovereignty, which is this thinking subject. The word subject, which has been used all along as that which is thrown before, subjected to, the subject of a king, now turns around and becomes the central thinking person and takes over, and we begin to translate nominalists from clause into English as the subject of the verb. The subject of the verb is what the verb throws before, but now it becomes the one who rules the sentence. It's an enormous philosophical shift that takes place over 100 years, but when you come out at the other end of 100 years, what you have is an individual thinking subject as the one who establishes the truth. And God becomes then a matter of human experience. Johannes Metz and Rahner point out that in the modern era, one doesn't talk about God directly, one talks about God through the lens of our human experience. It's my experience, that. And that then becomes a source of truth. Rahner formulates it as no longer do we talk about God, we ask the question of who is the human being who knows a God. And the question of the existence of God becomes a function of human belief in God. Are you with me? It's an enormous transformation in the way we think about the world. And in doing so, it puts the thinking human subject with doubt, with skepticism, right at the heart. One step, if you're with me, from Descartes to Locke, The Reasonableness of Christianity in 1695. Locke's treatise, I think, is the most important piece for modern evangelical theology. Because what Locke says is you don't need a church. You don't need any worship services. What you need is a Bible which has a source of information about God and your own thinking mind. And everybody should read the Bible themselves and come to their own conclusion. Did those miracles happen? Who is the God in there? What is that God like? Is Jesus the Messiah? Decide for yourself. Read the Bible and decide for yourself without any authority of a church, of a teacher. The thinking subject, the thinking person becomes the center of this world. And now that thinking person is freed from authority of church and other kinds of external authorities. Put that together with scientific evidence and you have Kant's enormous revolution in thinking. See, I've run you through the whole Enlightenment in just 5 minutes. But if you remember, Kant's in the Critique of Pure Reason comes at the end of that book to decide that pure reason by itself cannot give us any certainties. There are a number of 8 oppositional ideas that he can't establish the truth of. And he comes to the notion that God cannot be reasonably arrived at. And he shifts the whole question of God from the first critique to the second critique of practical reason. God becomes necessary for there to be morality. And so religion gets confined to being a moral question and handling morals and not dealing with questions of truth. That's pretty much where a whole lot of religionists are going to go. We'll police the moral landscape and tell you either to believe or tell you you don't really have to believe, whether you're going in an evangelical conservative direction or a more liberal direction. And that's going to really set in place the modern opposition between science and reason. Between a reason and faith. That reason is what you do for yourself. Faith is when you give up that and trust something else. Faith means to believe what the church, one of Tom's questions is going to be implicit faith. Implicit faith is when you trust what the authorities say. Explicit faith is when you study it yourself. And what Locke is saying is explicit faith is going to lead you to a place where you don't need a church, where you can reasonably think about and come to your own conclusions. Or if you want to do it in the contemporary jargon, pick and choose which pieces do you like and put together your own religious worldview, because you become the one who organizes it. It really is about your center. I think that positions us at the beginning of the 20th century and into the early 20th century in ways that are really complex and problematic. And coming out of that, I think Weber was right already in 1918 to say the scientific worldview is beginning to be questioned. I said last week, one of the places it became severely questioned after 1945 was the scientists gave us the atom bomb. Is there no moral implications of that? How do you link moral with intellectual work? How do you put these pieces back together in ways that have integrity? The person I turned to finally, and I could have done a number of them, but a person I think who's done this probably with most intentionality has been Paul Tillich in the 20th century. I know he's from the 50s. I could take you to some contemporary ones. You're going to get there next week with Frederick. I want to walk through Tillich and just give you some places where his language about faith and reason begin to re-articulate a new kind of synthesis. And for Tillich, that was necessary for us to move ahead. Systematic Theology, which was published in 53 to 65, Volume 1. In Lutheran Protestantism, the phrase justification by faith was partly responsible for the distortion of doctrine into a tool of self-salvation. And he's right. Luther said justified by faith, direct relationship with Christ, it becomes eventually self-salvation. It's your faith in Christ, not something else. It's just you and God, this one-on-one. And so you're really responsible for your own salvation. Tillich writes, faith as a state of being grasped by an ultimate was distorted and became belief in a doctrine. There's his definition. Faith is the experience of being grasped by something. Thus, faith as the reception of the message that one is accepted became a proposition for intellectual affirmation. Page 155, Volume 1. Faith is based on the experience of being grasped by the power of the new being through which the destructive consequences of estrangement are conquered. Tillich is consistent through it. Faith is the experience of being grasped by something, compelled by something, something that arrests your imagination, something that won't let you go, something that draws you in. Faith is a state of being grasped by the divine presence. And then faith is a state of being grasped by the transcendent unity of unambiguous life. It embodies love as the state of being taken into that transcendent unity. Finally, from the system, faith formally or generally defined as the state of being grasped by that toward which self-transcendence aspires, the ultimate in being and meaning. In a short formula, one can say that faith is a state of being grasped by an ultimate concern. He's pretty consistent there. For Tillich, faith is not something we have. Faith is something we experience, and it's an experience that we're being compelled by something outside of ourselves. He's going to go on and say that can happen in science. It can happen in economy. The person who is so compelled to discover what is the cure for this cancer is actually operating on faith. The driving engine that's going to keep somebody sustained in a project, so much so that for Tillich, faith becomes the capacity to stay involved in a project in life to get you to realize its end. Some of those projects, he's going to say, Tom said this last week, some of those projects are not worthy of being ultimate concerns. In those cases, faith is idolatrous. If my drive is to make a lot of money, which could all disappear overnight and doesn't have any kind of sustaining value after me, that money has become an idol. If my drive is to make money in order to use it for some other kind of transcendent purposes, then it's being transposed in a way that the penultimate is serving an ultimate. And Tillich understood that much of us in the modern era are driven by idols, modern idolatries, but they're elevating penultimate concerns to ultimate concerns. That need for an improvement of my job, the need for more money has a transcendent end, the need to transform the world and to use that money to make transformation happen, or even to leave something for my children. For Tillich, that has a self-transcending end. But simply to make it so I can go out and enjoy it myself or because of greed, that for Tillich was idolatrous. But seeing that, he understands faith, that the scientist has to have faith, that faith is a more sustaining. Now then, in the dynamics of faith, he's going to differentiate between the two kinds of reason. One of them is the technical reason that I apply in an experiment, and I see the technique works, and it gives a certain reason. And a second one he's going to call the deeper, older Greek understanding of reason as value assessment. Reason as a kind of understanding where our place is in the universe. Faith is a state of being ultimately concerned, he says in the dynamics of faith. That's it. You all have page 4, right? Yes. Okay, good. Faith as ultimate concern is an act of the total personality. It happens in the center of personal life and includes all of its elements. Page 4. Here's this long quote that I think is a good way to end, and then I'm going to just let you digest it and we'll talk. Reason is the precondition of faith. Isn't that great? Reason is the precondition of faith. Faith is the act in which reason reaches ecstatically beyond itself. This is just the opposite of their being within each other. Humanity's reason is finite. It moves within finite relations when dealing with the universe and with humankind itself. But reason is not bound by its own finitude. It is aware of it, and so doing, it rises above it. Humanity experiences a belonging in the infinite, which, however, is neither a part of ourselves nor something in our power. It must grasp us, and if it does, it is a matter of infinite concern. Man is infinite. I'm just going to go back to his gendered language. Man is finite. Man's reason lives in preliminary concerns, but man is also aware of his potential infinity, and this awareness appears as his ultimate concern, as faith. If reason is grasped by an ultimate concern, it's driven beyond itself. It does not cease to be reason, finite reason. The ecstatic experience of the ultimate concern does not destroy the structure of reason. Ecstasy is fulfilled, not denied, rationally. Reason can be fulfilled only if it is driven beyond the limits of its finitude and experiences that presence of the ultimate, the holy. Without such an experience, reason exhausts itself in its finite contents, finally becomes filled with irrational and demonic contents, and is destroyed by them. The road leads from reason fulfilled in faith through reason without faith to reason filled with demonic destructive faith. That second stage is only a point of transition, since there's no vacuum in a spiritual life, as there is none in nature. Reason is the presupposition of faith. Faith is the fulfillment of reason. Wow. I think what Tillich is saying in the same way he did culture and religion. Culture is the body, religion is the soul. Spirituality is the depth. It's what runs through these bodies, but reason is what actually gets the running going. And you can't have one without the other for Tillich. You can't have faith without reason, without the grasping, without the capacity to grasp, to think it through. But reason isn't what does the transcendent work. Faith is what is the transcendent work, which allows you to stay and see that which is beyond reason's limits. The hope that I'm actually going to get that promotion when it's not reasonable right now to think so. The hope that I'm going to get a vacation when I can't really see my way forward, but I'm going to live in that. Tillich puts them back together and tries to help us see a way in which we don't live in an oppositional universe and we don't settle into those philosophical categories that make it either or, but really see the one needs the other without being dissolved into the other. And that's where I go with this, kind of pathways out.